Ultimately, we're going to want to phase out fossil fuels. We're going to want to convert to an alternative energy economy. And what that is, we can still discuss, but in my view, it is unlikely to be nuclear power for all the obvious pollution concerns. And much more promising is solar power, which produces no greenhouse gases and does not involve radioactivity and is already economically competitive with fossil fuels if we take account of the environmental cost of the burning of those fossil fuels. That's the kind of technology we should be after. And incidentally, because developing countries tend to be located in equatorial latitudes where there's more sunlight, this is also an ideal kind of technology and could be, for them, and could be much more indigenous, that is, the technology homegrown, than big fission or fusion reactors.
The space program languish in the last 10 or 15 years as we have let all sorts of social programs languish, as we have permitted the amount of poverty in children to increase. Before the end of this century, more than half the kids in America may be below the poverty line. What kind of a future do we build for the country if we raise all these kids as disadvantaged, as unable to cope with the society, as resentful for the injustice served up to them? This is stupid.
And then what happened with the resources is they went into increasing budgets for arms. Isn't that where the money went?
That and making rich people richer. Those are the two places.
Well, the thing about rich people, and being one, I guess, is the money all gets reinvested. If you've got money, you put it in the bank lends it out to people to buy homes or cars or whatever.
Not poor people. But not poor people.
Well, that's a good point.
It tends to stay up at that highly stratified, very...
More people get employed with capital formation and so forth. Are you a socialist?
I'm not sure what a socialist is,
well,
but I believe that the government has a responsibility to care for the people. And I'm not talking about dole. I'm talking about making people self-reliant, people able to take care of themselves. There are countries which are perfectly able to do that. The United States is an extremely rich country. It's perfectly able to do that. It chooses not to. It chooses to have homeless people. We are 19th in the world in infant mortality. 18 other countries save the lives of their babies better than we. How come? They just spend more money on it. They care about their babies more than we care about ours. I think it's a disgrace.
Greenhouse warming is the buildup of invisible gases. Their invisibility is precisely part of the problem, because you can't just by looking see that there's a danger, which keep the heat in and build up the temperature of the earth, producing great regions of drought in continental interiors, including the American Midwest, and through the volume expansion of seawater and the melting of polar ice, sea level rising. And some of the projections for the end of the next century are extremely serious: drought, the destruction of croplands worldwide, an assault on natural ecosystems, and a rising of sea level sufficient to, for example, flood Bangladesh and produce tens of millions of environmental refugees. Maybe not. Maybe there's some undiscovered mistake that all of the scientists involved in these models are making. It's not impossible. We can't be 100% sure. But which is more prudent? Which is wiser? To do nothing and hope that a mistake has been made? Or to take these predictions seriously, even if there's a chance the precautions you will take will be unnecessary?
Global warming, the greenhouse effect. You put gases like carbon dioxide or CFCs, other greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere over this country. They don't stay over that country. Those molecules don't have passports. They don't know about national sovereignty. That's something they never heard of. The atmospheric circulation spreads those gases all over the planet. And so what one country does affects all the other countries. The solution to these kinds of problems has to be that everybody on Earth works together. The industrialized nations have the biggest responsibility because they're the biggest polluters. The United States puts more CO2 in the atmosphere than any other nation. But Western Europe and the Soviet Union and Japan and even the developing countries all make significant contributions. So there has to be a new way of looking at the future, and that is that we're all humans, members of the same species, on one fragile little planet. We're all in this together, and we have to work together. That's kind of the silver lining of these crises. They are forcing us to become a planetary species.
There is, of course, a role for individuals, and that is one of the blessings of democracies, and that is individuals can play their part by voting out of office recalcitrant politicians. It's very straightforward. I can't improve the greenhouse effect much on my own by my own energy economy at home. I can make some contribution, but I can make a bigger contribution by voting against politicians who say that they can't do anything about this problem.
They can make sure that candidates who don't understand and aren't deeply committed to ending and reversing the nuclear arms race, to stopping greenhouse warming, and to stopping the depletion of the ozonosphere, that those guys aren't, men and women, are not elected. It's not enough to have a candidate say, I'm an environmentalist. In what way are you an environmentalist, Mr. or Ms. candidate? Take a look at the most recent election. There we had a candidate who said that he was an environmentalist. He, in contrast to the previous 8 years, where we had an uncompromising anti-environmentalist in the White House. Okay, now there's a president, Mr. Bush, who at least acknowledges that there's a problem. We didn't even know that from listening to Mr. Reagan. But if you look at Mr. Bush's budget, we see not a hint of any real commitment to the environment. So I say, in a democracy, that's the most important thing a person can do. There are a lot of other things a person can do. You can plant trees. Every individual can plant trees. That's something that's very constructive. You can boycott industries which are irresponsible on global warming and on chlorofluorocarbons. There are many things people can do, but they have to understand the issue before they can do those things.
On the other hand, there's not something that we can do as individuals. I cannot go and drive a 75-mile-per-gallon automobile because they are not commercially available. So it's no good to tell me, as my friend Mr. Riley did, that we shouldn't complain to the government or the industry. We should just do it ourselves. How shall I go about by myself driving a 75-mile-per-gallon automobile? I'll be glad to take instruction on this issue. I'm ready. But seems to me this requires some activity in Washington and Detroit. If there was no concept of having stewardship of the earth a million years ago, today there is at least a very great need. If you stand back from the earth, as those Apollo astronauts did in the late 60s, and photograph the earth from a distance in space so you can see the whole earth, there's this blue aura that you can see surrounding the daylit hemisphere. And it's just the atmosphere seen edge on. And what is most impressive, what many astronauts have remarked upon, is how thin, how fragile, how vulnerable it seems. The thickness of the Earth's atmosphere compared to the size of the Earth is about the same as the thickness of a coat of shellac on a library globe of the Earth. There isn't much air. And so we now have the prospect of inadvertently endangering the life-supporting environment, the environment that supports the human species, and many other species, of committing what religious people sometimes call crimes against creation.
Humans have been on this planet for something like 1 million years, and for the vast bulk of that time, things change extremely slowly. The population increased very slowly. Our technology improved, but by very slow steps. And just recently, this is what's called an exponential. It's flat for a long time, and then boom, you suddenly get a huge increase. Increase in population, increase in technology, increase in pollution, increase in our powers to disturb the environment, to change the planetary environment. But we're the same old human beings as we were 1,000 years ago and 100,000 years ago. Not much has changed with us. And so it's very hard for us to catch on that there's a new situation and we have to adapt to it. On the other hand, that's one thing we humans are good at, adapting, figuring out. We're smart. That's our principal advantage over all the other species. I mean, we're not faster, stronger, better diggers. We don't fly all by ourselves. What we do is figure out and build because of our hands. And so I think there's certainly a chance of getting out of this mess, but not by business as usual, not by the idea that we shouldn't plan ahead, not by the idea that anybody can do whatever the hell they want and it doesn't affect the environment. There has to be a new way of looking at the world.